Jean-Baptiste Pettier, professor for the social and cultural anthropology of East Asia at the Friedrich-Alexander-Universität Erlangen-Nuremberg, Germany, presents his talk on the topic, What's New with Love in East Asia? Ethnographic and Theoretical Perspectives. Jean-Baptiste Pettier is professor for the social and cultural anthropology of East Asia at the Friedrich-Alexander-Universität Erlangen-Nuremberg, Germany, where he leads the MA program Standards of Decision-Making Across Cultures, SDAC. He is a social anthropologist with a broad interdisciplinary background in the social sciences and a specialization in Chinese society. His core research interests concern sentiments, affect, and morality, and their relationship to political and economic conditions. Today, he will give a talk on the topic, What's New with Love in East Asia? Ethnographic and Theoretical Perspectives.
The lecture I will give today as a personal starting point. This was in a Chinese language course, let me start timing, of intermediate level taken in the spring of 2007 at Minzu University in Beijing. The class was evenly divided between students of Western nationalities, in my memory mostly Americans, then French and at least one Italian, and East Asian nationalities, in this case South Koreans and Japanese only. The course alternated between explanations concerning Chinese language and debates. That day, the teacher had led the exchange on the topic of love and marriage and was having fun showing us that on this issue, the world, at least within our classroom, was visibly split into two. After starting by explaining the predominant role played by parents in the choice of a partner in China, not only in the decision-making process, but also in the selection process, having parents of low socioeconomic status is a disqualifying factor. Clearly sure of her effects, she asked us to give our opinions on the matter one after the other. With a few nuances that I do not remember, the students from Western countries one by one insisted on the greater importance in their eyes of the persons themselves rather than their social origin. The Korean and Japanese students, with the exception of one young Korean who was actually a student of social sciences too, gave more or less the opposite answer. The climax came when a female Japanese student, usually very reserved, responded in a rather scornful, sarcastic tone, asking why she should be interested in a man who didn't come from a good family. Korea and Japan are economically rich countries whose demographic transitions and urbanization processes appear as complete. They are widely known for being at the cutting edge of technology. They are also rapidly aging countries, where the place of the elderly is of paramount importance, well beyond the traditional attachment to ancestors or filial piety. Even if with a delay, China already seemed at that time to be moving resolutely in the same direction 15 years ago. Thus, the comments made that day highlighted the apparent inadequacy of the discourse describing modernity as the triumph of the individual and with it of romantic love, as earlier theorists of love had anticipated. Of course, this is not to ignore the possible group pressure or the still limited linguistic level of the participants in Mandarin, which may have led them on that day to confine themselves to expressing a rather simple opinion, even if it meant appearing as conformist. But I was struck by the class's geographical divide. Indeed, families of ideas and family ideas are the texture of the social sciences. Opposition over our degree of agency, the role of imitation or culture in human reasoning, on our individual choices, continue to form deep trenches in the battlefields of ideas. Structural determinations and individual autonomy, what is culture, what is cultural, what is identity, what is personal and what is collected, and even the existence of civilizations, these are all points of debates and major breaks in theories, and love has often been central to the matter. By returning to the observation made that day, this essay is an attempt to take seriously what looked like a common dynamic without limiting myself to cultural explanations and generalizations. In earlier publications, I particularly focused on the role of matchmakers in China, on the history and functioning of marriage markets, as well as on the place granted to love inside them. In the latter article, I suggested that a new moral economy of love has arisen in China over the last 2 decades, which partially reconciles opposing views that made the place of love conflictual in earlier phases of the modernization process. Among the urban middle-class populations that I've been working with, this arrangement consists in a strong rhetorical emphasis on the importance of romantic love in conjunction with a balanced distribution of the power to make marriage decisions between the parental and bachelor's generations. I maintain that the latter is intended as a fallback mechanism to protect families against what is seen and perceived as the blindness attributed to love. This new moral economy, which produces and distributes moral values surrounding love in a way that favors the upper middle class, rests on a certain intergenerational arrangement. I suggested that this new moral economy was specific to the urban context and particularly to middle and upper middle class, whom I described as using love as a mechanism of discrimination against less favored social classes. I based this interpretation on the discourses that I collected within marriage markets, where parents often reject explicitly people they name outsiders, which they accuse to manipulate love in order to climb up in society. I also showed the other side of that experience by recounting the history of Zhang Li, an ambitious young man from a low social background whom I had befriended and who had been rejected by the family of a young, better-born lady that he had been dating in the city of Chengdu in central China. The question I intend to ask today is, how specific is this model to China? The conditions of the population I've worked with are characterized by 2 elements. First, there has been a drastic reduction in family size due to state-backed family planning. Second, social and economic competition is strongly reinforced among the newly formed middle and upper middle urban classes. Together, these have strengthened the intergenerational material and affective interdependency within the family, as well as the emphasis put on individual characteristics, intimacy, and sentiments between marriage partners. So what to make of the fact that, from what I've been able to describe for China, I've read blatant equivalence in offers working on neighboring countries. When it comes to love, is a unified East Asia making sense? Could this regional scale contribute to the understanding of the issue without the risk of betraying the nuances that are obviously necessary if we are talking here about more than 1.6 billion people, 1/5 of the world's population? Altogether, East Asian societies are confronted today to many common difficulties. A drop in marriage numbers, a large number of singles, a sense that solitude and social isolation are widespread, an increase of age at first marriage, a drop in fertility rates, a high level of pressure on women to marry young, a high level of pressure on men to be materially successful, exceptional levels of spending on child education, and amongst the highest level of urbanization in the world, with often real estate prices that went through the roof. Consequently, these societies have all started to age rapidly. All of them, including China since 2022, have started to see their populations shrink. This is so even for these societies do not have the same political systems, making the regional dimension of the issue particularly intriguing. To be clear, none of these issues is specific to East Asia. Aging societies, declining fertility rates, and the isolation of individuals are today common issues across the developed urbanized world. Yet, there are interesting differences. To the best of my knowledge, families in Paris, Roma, Berlin, or New York confronted to these issues rarely get involved in introducing their children to potential partners. If necessary, their children prefer to use dating apps rather than matchmakers and marriage agencies. These certainly exist, but even so, they rarely constitute legally regulated institutions. Nor is the lowering of the average marriage age in Italy attributed to any general shyness of young Italians, as is the case when analyzing the phenomena in China and Japan, as I will show later. Socialization, especially professional socialization, is undoubtedly highly gendered in many countries, excluding many women from promotions, but perhaps nowhere else in the form of KTVs, where almost exclusively male executives sing along while being accompanied by sexily dressed young waitresses, as is the case from Japan to China. Similarly, the deferment of marriage has different meanings, depending on the importance attributed to it by society. In East Asian countries, births outside marriage remain rare and strongly stigmatized. The institution of marriage remains dominant and universal. Except for Taiwan, and what we've just seen, but it's not legal marriage, none has made legal same-sex marriage legal. So can we make sense of this? When we consider the decline in fertility in England or late marriage in Italy, we do not culturalize these phenomena. By contrast, the opposite is often true when it comes to the study of East Asian societies, in particular through an emphasis put on Confucianism. Two competitive regimes of explanations are often found to explain the issue. And here I show it with two examples, just two cases. The first one is an article which studies the issue from the perspective of the influence of the values of Confucianism all over the region to understand and analyze the issues at stake. The second one places instead the emphasis on something completely different, the cost of housing, and says that the cost of housing may be the biggest factor. I believe these two explanations to be false or at least insufficient. If the first was, there would be no ground for the largely newness of the phenomenon, which was not always the same across time. It also does not account for the observable variations within the region, particularly across social classes, as well as across urban and rural areas. Neither seems the second explanation to be sufficient to address the issue. If the price of housing and being overworked render people unable to meet partners and have children, we should be seeing matchmaking bureaus popping up in Paris, London, and New York, and birth rates drop much further down than they have in these cities. The point is that these phenomena certainly exist in other places too, but not at the scale experienced in East Asia. That such issues concern the world does not mean, however, that they are problematized in the same way everywhere, much less articulated in the same way, and certainly not that similar solutions are proposed to them. Thus, what we observe is an original phenomenon which is both somehow specific in its extent, but even more in the way in which it is locally understood and addressed. So, in order to understand the contemporary history of love in East Asia, it is necessary to come back a bit in time, about 150 years ago. And it's good that Professor Mangpan just made a presentation on the last 70 years. I'm going back a bit further down in time. Love is certainly not foreign to East Asian nations, who had classic stories and representations of lovers in pre-modern times, to which I cannot return in the limited space of this presentation. However, something new happens in respect to love in the 19th century, which has to do with its thematization in the liberal script developing by then in Europe. At that time, East Asian nations, with the exceptions of Vietnam, escaped colonization but not armed confrontation with the European powers. The unequal balance of power manifested itself in the granting of territorial concessions, the opening of trading posts, forced opening of trading posts, and the establishment of economic agreements profitable to Westerners. As in other parts of the world, this confrontation between the East Asian states and the European colonial powers raised structural questions about the place of the individual in society. The debates sparked by this transformation largely revolved around the notion of love. The importance to be attached to be given to personal feelings in the construction of couples, it generated a fever of moral, political, and literary debates on the choice of spouse, marriage, and the status of women. Between the end of the 19th century and the 1930s, these debates crossed and transformed the whole of East Asia. Since not everyone, I had to put here a slide and just say so, just reminding what's happening at that time in Europe, the way love and marriage should be attached together has been a major intellectual concern, but I think you all know that and we don't need to really go through this. The Romantic movement emphasized very much the importance of romantic feelings and the necessity to confront and stop the tradition of arranged marriage. The idea, you all know this very well, was that by choosing their partners by themselves, human actors were supposed to become full and modern individuals, thus developing new capacities for innovation and for progress. In simple words, free marriage based on love was seen as a key to modernization theories. This is why this debate arrived in East Asia. This is how this has been framed at the time in the European debate. So, since not everyone is in the room is, I'm sure, an expert of East Asia, I will now briefly recount this story, which is important to understand the current situation. So, I'm not going through this. The path to reform began in Japan. While the arrangement of marriage was widespread in Japan amongst samurai families, marriage remained informal and had a variety of forms in the country among common people. Confronted to the model of Western countries and desirous to assert one unified Japanese tradition, late 19th century elites imposed the samurai system as the model, the unified model for national marriage. Yet the moral textbooks of the turn of the 20th century gradually also instilled closer emotional ties between spouses and between generations within the home. At the heart of controversies over the national model of marriage, the place of the family in the choice of a spouse, the problematization of the feeling of love and its social importance is also particularly significant. This is illustrated by the difficulties, for example, encountered in translating the English word of love, particularly in the translation of the Bible. After many attempts, a new word is created in Japanese, jenai, a combination of an ancient term, koi, designated both, which was designating earlier carnal and spiritual world, and love, and the word I, love, whose meaning is transformed in the process. It was a less physical love. So this new word is created to name amorous passion. For those discovering this new term in Japan at the time, its etymology initially seems particularly strange. You have this opposition within it to Japanese and allogen to Japanese culture, to the extent that despite the undeniable historical success of this new word, its applicability to Japan can still be contested by some today. Nevertheless, the new term was later adopted into Chinese vocabulary. The Japanese janai becomes the Chinese lianai, where it is subsequently become of common use. And this is the word commonly used today to name love in a love relationship in China. The term that would henceforth designate love within a couple in both Japan and China after that is thus a linguistic construction of the late 19th century, stemming from issues that had appeared in the context of a translation of the Bible. Oh, I had wrote all this in details here, I forgot. I'm going now, so here you have the word, Genai. Yeah. And then it turns into Lianai in Mandarin. So I'm going now to switch to Korea. The influence of this model and the role played by love had an impact on the whole region, because you know what is happening at that time. Japan then colonizes Korea, subjecting Korean society to similar problem to those faced by its colonizer 30 years earlier. It had to transform itself in order to better defend itself, choosing how to modernize while managing to resist the cultural forms and vocabulary imposed by the dominant power, which in that case is Japan. At the beginning of the 20th century, the male elite, this is something that is recounted in this book by Laurel Kendall and also in other academic works. The male elite began so to call for a certain liberalization of the matrimonial sphere as they sought greater autonomy in the choice of a wife. It also worried families who saw themselves in danger of losing control of a domain that had until then depended essentially on them. So families are afraid of losing control on the mate choice for their children. The notion of love thus plays an ambiguous role here, caught between the Japanese desire to establish cultural domination and the young Koreans' need to assert themselves in order to defend and resist. In this very particular context, Korean-American anthropologist Chun Sung Kim cites a Korean educational song from the early 20th century. Its content provides a particularly striking insight into the controversial nature of the theme of love at the time. So he's telling us that this song was taught to millions of children at the time as a sign of resistance of to Japan. So I never know what love was. I don't know what love is. I don't care what love is. I don't intend to be told what love is. Get a marriage. Love does not need to lead to marriage, but marriage leads to love if such a thing as love exists. We have to understand this in the context of resistance to Japanese domination. Love thus is here. The political nature of love in Korea at the time is clearly here in no doubt. And resisting Japan could just as easily mean resisting love, this newly imported definition, at least in its form as an ideological import from Japan. And this is the same issue that Japan had encountered 30 years earlier. So in China, debates concerning love and opposition to the tradition of arranged marriage have been constant along the 20th century. Regularly, love has found itself at the heart of clashes between an ethic of individual freedom and an ethic of responsibility. During the 1911 revolution that gave birth to the Republic of China, the reform of family norms was at the heart of the revolutionaries' concerns. For them, challenging the code of Neo-Confucianism and its social rigidity was an essential point. Revolutionary leaders wanted to replace submission to clan and family with allegiance to the Chinese fatherland. 8 years later, in 1919, we are at the end of World War I, and the Treaty of Versailles is signed, which officially gives the control of the former German concessions in the Chinese territory to Japan. The episode is an humiliation, obviously, for China. The event triggers a major nationalist movement. This movement, for the emergence of a new culture, largely blamed China's international weakness on that of its people. Arranged marriage and the maintenance of concubines are considered feudal customs and obstacles to Chinese modernization. The incapacity made to young people to determine for themselves who will be their life partner is seen as stifling the capacity for initiative of the younger generations and thus at the source of national weakness. So after decades of struggle during which the question of free marriage has been a crucial ideological issue, we have seen the next steps with Wang Pan's presentation. After that comes into power the Communist Party, and with this new law that prevents free marriage, that imposes free marriage, monogamy, equality between the spouses, and so on. And I switch now, so to, with these two, what happened at the same time in Vietnam. So Vietnam of the late 19th century is colonized by the French. Young people's view on their future spouse begins to be taken into account at that time. In the 1920s and 1930s, the country, in turn, experienced an anti-Confucian literary movement calling for the modernization of the country. So we have seen it starts in the 1870s in Japan, goes in the early 20th century in Korea, 20 years later in China, and 10 years later we have similar movements in Vietnam. So we see here a movement calling for the modernization of the country, a questioning of traditional family morality, and calling for the development of individual autonomy. The social position of women was thus at the heart of political debate, with the publication of hundreds of books and pamphlets on this issue. Right from Ho Chi Minh's proclamation of independence in 1946, the constitution of the new Communist Democratic Republic of Vietnam encouraged love marriage rather than those arranged by parents. In 1959, the first marriage law was enacted, making love the legal basis for marriage and forbidding marriage arranged by parents. Again, these controversies were clearly about modernizing society and resisting colonization. So with Vietnam, the dynamic launched in Japan in the debates of the early Meiji era and subsequently extended in Korea and China came to an end. In the space of half a century, the entire region will have been ablaze with debates on love, marriage, and the place of the individual, with what is really at stake at the time being the ability of the society to reassert their autonomy and position on the regional and international political scenes. Now, if all the countries of the region have placed romantic love and the emancipation of the individual at the core of their debates and reforms more or less a century ago, what to make of the fact that marriage seems to represent until today a major issue and that the presence and importance of love is still highly debated in them? A century after the debates about love that swept through the region, entry into marriage life often continues to take place through formal or informal intermediations. And we have just seen that this was forbidden in many places, including China, including Vietnam. It often involves family negotiations and collective arrangements combining reinvented traditions and sentimental elements. Tracing the history of this evolution, I maintain that the current situation cannot be understood as a temporary slowdown on the road to marriage for autonomous individuals. On the contrary, I propose to read into it the emergence of a new and non-liberal model of the subject. The point here is to see how the confrontation with the Western model may, in fact, at least in part, have precipitated the advent of a common trend which did not necessarily exist with such an extent before. I will maintain later that to understand this situation, we have to examine it as the result of a certain configurational situation rather than to look at it with only cultural lenses. This lack of a single point of departure before the confrontation with Western colonial powers leads us to an initial observation. If we seek to understand contemporary transformations in love and the choice of spouse in East Asia, we must first break with unity and observe that for a long time, the existing practice in the region were rather diverse, provided we don't reduce the practices of these countries to those of their elites, which were then rather unified by the common system of reference and the education to Chinese classics. It's true that China very early on imposed the social institution of marriage rather than free union. But the dominant practices in China were probably only adopted by the elites of Korea and Japan. When the Japanese modernizers of the early Meiji era sought to identify a national practice, they couldn't find one. They came back empty-handed, and they had to build a new Japanese tradition. In the absence of a single point of departure, however, this was a major turning point. In their search for national unity, Japanese modernizers ended up imposing it by adopting as their norm the matrimonial practices of the elite of the time. So this great divergence continues to this day. Anthropologists of contemporary Japan observe that the practices of urban Japan and rural Japan are distinct. This essay follows the thread of this major inflection point, examining the transformation of essentially elitist and urban practices whose surprising proximity I observe here after a century of observation. As shown by my Chinese language teacher's exercise, I return to the early point of this presentation, in highlighting the continental divide in the heart of our classroom, it happens that the notion of a certain regional unity appears obvious to those primarily concerned. This was confirmed to me on another occasion. When several years later I was visiting Beijing marriage markets for my doctoral thesis research, a father told me that the development of these meetings, which is a new phenomenon of the early 2000s, was an eminently positive phenomenon, demonstrating the extent of their responsibility towards their children, as much as the improvement in their degree of openness. After all, he told me, before, this was already a problem, but we were not doing anything about it. According to him, this progress was not simply a step forward for China, and he then insisted on the Asian dimension of the phenomenon, citing the cases of Taiwan, Korea, and Japan, where he asserted that similar practices existed. This is false if we are looking in these countries for a phenomenon similar to the Chinese marriage markets. On the other hand, the emphasis placed on the role of parents makes sense. The strong thematization of parenting in East Asia was redoubled when he told me that these regional practices demonstrate that Eastern parents are far more responsible than their Western counterparts, who, in his view, do not care about their children's difficulties in getting married. The idea that Eastern parents are more responsible and supportive of their children than Western ones was not uncommon in the meetings I attended. Regularly, participants would point out as evidence that my own parents, for their part, apparently were not that concerned about my situation. Thought of in this way, parental interventions in the marriage of their children becomes a reason for cultural pride. It becomes a strength, underlining the bonds of solidarity between generations. At the same time, it embodies a political construct in which the quality of individuals, and of elites in particular, is embodied in their emotional interdependency. Interestingly, this discourse represents a counterpoint to the modernist perspective. From this point of view, parents who led their children to their single condition are not understood as respecting their children's autonomy, but rather as failing in their responsibility of parents. Several common themes appear in the literature dedicated to marriage issues across East Asian countries today. Below, based on some recent literature review, I will discuss mainly three of them. The first one is the role of gender politics. The second one is the shyness and the necessity of go-betweens. And the last one is the role of the family. So, first on gender. One central element in all the literature over the region is the strong heteronormativity of social lives, which is often considered as reinforcing the issues encountered by making the stakes of a marriage higher. On one side, there are strong divisions of the level of professional opportunities offered according to gender. Women's work is not taken seriously, neither ambitious women were rather discouraged and discriminated against. Women are first of all supposed to do a career as a wife and as a mother. On another side, there is a strong expectation that men should dominate, make better careers and have better salaries. They can marry while a bit older, while women have to do so earlier. This implies both that women are asked to accept to lots of renouncements when they will marry, but as well, on the opposite side, that the public discourse often turns against them if they do not marry. They are thus perceived as threatening the entire society, and sexist, anti-feminist discourse often appear in public politics. Hence, the insulting names of loser dog Maikanu in Japanese, old maiden in Vietnam, or Changnu leftover in China, that they are attributed when they are not simply compared to unaffected parking lots. And this is quotation. In other words, the political discourse tends to stigmatize non-married women, while providing them little support to actually start families. Yet, in her comparative studies of single women in Tokyo, Shanghai, and Hong Kong, Lynn Nakano observes that her interviewees do not usually contest or intently challenge the heteronormative system. She observes that the women she meets, so she's doing this research with single women in 3 different countries, in 3 different cities. The urban context is here very important. The women she's interviewing have no children. They have never married. And usually you have to marry in these societies to have children. Mostly they have no current partner. This is very important. And mostly they live with their parents. So this is important since it shows that the fact that marriage drop implies actually a liberalization, and the fact that they would be, that young people, women would be irresponsible, have adventures without the intention to marry and so on, as the public discourse accuses them of doing, is actually false. But as Nakano observes, there is a reason to that. Governments in the societies under study have decided to depend on women's labor in families rather than develop social welfare systems. This is, according to her, the main reason for the difficulties of these women who are demanded to provide care for their families while no one will take care of them if they marry and have a baby. Thus, while they intend to marry, and that's important that they express the intention to marry, they have to find a husband who could support them for this, and who would as well actually make a better career than them in order to satisfy heteronormative expectations. This, while they have made their best to go as far as they could for their studies and professionally in order to support their families. So in the current economic competitions and conditions, this proves to be a challenge. As she observes, in all 3 cities, women who want to marry generally think that the man should ideally be older and possess greater social and financial capital than themselves. In the absence of these potential husbands, they are not willing to engage into a marriage because they have already made great sacrifices to support their families and could not put themselves at the risk to have to do more without support. And this is also a point that what presents in the work of Alex 2 days ago in Korea, the fact that Korean women are most afraid of sacrificing too much for their partners. Based on Nagano's account, the understanding of the difficulties to marry and low fertility is explained by very concrete and material difficulties. Yet other themes are also found in the literature. I turn now to the question of shyness. We find the theme of shyness almost everywhere, where the question of the link between the existence of institutionalized process of matchmaking and the apparent inability of young people to find a spouse who serves as justification is raised. Regarding Japan, Ruth Benedict spoke at the end of the Second World War of a socially maintained male shyness. A decade later, the absence of established patterns of courtship was proposed as an explanation by Ronald Dorr for the persistence of arranged dating processes in post-war Japan. This is something that we see everywhere in the area. The ideal of love, of romantic love, has been accepted, and at the same time, people continue to rely on the introduction of go-betweens. That author observes the absence of role models for such relationship. It is not insignificant that he emphasized at the same time that this problem particularly concerns the middle classes. The same explanation is again used by Walter Edwards around 20 years later, and again several decades later when Erika Alpert, in her book on Japanese matchmakers, published in 2022, observes about ideals of masculinity in Japan that men are traditionally allowed to be mukushi, I'm not sure if I pronounce that well, literally without mouth. Similar accounts were given in Vietnam, where an author like Nguyen Van Ky also raises the question of timidity, even if he sees it as a problem that the reformers of the 1930s would have managed to resolve. The incapacity attributed to young people to find partners implies from the society the necessity to act. Yet the latter comes in opposition with the modern notions of autonomous individuals choosing their partners by themselves. At the crossroad of the taboo of the go-between and the injunction to use it lies the connection between... Is it? I'm not even reached 40 minutes here. Oh, sorry. But I will then try to go faster. The crossroads of the taboo, if I really have to go fast, that will be a bit more complicated, obviously. So basically, we have, I will then rather present it orally by going through the slide much faster. So here we have in this book and in many other places this question, theoretical questions of how people deal with, on one side, their inability to meet people and the necessity to rely on matchmakers. This contradicts this notion that people would become autonomous. And we have here in a Chinese book published in 2019, Shen Yifei writes that basically a lot of young Chinese single children have become completely unable to live a life of their own. Wang Pan also in a presentation, in an article said that parents have regained the right to intervene in their families, in their children's decision, contrary to what the law says. So this turns us to the issue of the role of family. Seen from his angle, shyness or modesty becomes a reason for the deployment of emotional solidarity by parents to their children. This is exactly what happens in Marriage Market, where I did research. I'm not returning to this now. And similar situation can be found in multiple places. But I take now an example from Vietnam. In a recent ethnography of love in Vietnam, Nerav Choret describes the impossible split of romantic love from family love. She describes of how a young woman has to rely on presentation to find a partner and how this turns into a protean family affair. By contrast, she explained, if the young woman would have gone to a bar to try to meet someone by herself, she would have tarnished her reputation. Romantic love should not exclude the love of the family, and it implies that the family approval has to be searched before any choice of a partner. So to conclude, and concerning love, a few important remarks should be made. First, romantic love has been completely integrated into common discourse and expectation in East Asian countries through the histories that I briefly recounted. However, maybe due to the imported and mysterious nature of the concept, it has kept a sort of unworldly dimension that makes it often appear as desirable, but probably not reachable, and in many cases incompatible with the trivial matters of a marriage. Indeed, as Alpert shows, Japanese matchmakers encourage their clients to develop feelings for each other, but not love. Similarly, in Korea, Baldacchino observes that a melodramatic sensibility has been pervasive in contemporary Korea, an overtone put on the excessive, overdrawn, and overmarked character of love. This excessive, almost mystical character of the notion of love, in his view, leads to a certain avoidance of love in real lives, especially as it may lead to social mismatch. My paradoxical conclusion is that what is preventing many people from falling in love through East Asian societies is thus love itself. However, the way the ideal of romantic love has been sized in the last decades by the representation of higher classes and the material comforts they define as de rigueur to let oneself marry, reproduce, and produce quality lives. This last citation from Erika Alpert shows this, I think, but it's too long. Basically, she says a lot of the people she meets, of the young men, the young singles, they want to marry. They are not opposed to this. They want to have a family. They do not feel that they have the appropriate material condition to allow themselves to do it. So the ideal of what a marriage should be, the ideal of the ideal life, is preventing people from actually engaging into love relationship. Thanks. I will finish here. Sorry for the delay.
Thank you so very much. We have time, just really brief one question, so we can move on. Just because thank you for summarizing, John.
I hope it was still understandable. But maybe even better actually when I just speak like that than when I am actually reading. So
that was really great.
Thank you so much.
Really interesting, really fascinating. My sort of burning question or comment, I suppose, is that obviously gender runs through this whole story all the way back 150 years ago. And one of the things that I think it would be good to make distinctions around is who was driving the decisions around what constituted love, what constituted marriage.
Sure.
And that what we have up until very recently is actually a male-defined understanding of what's appropriate, what's allowed across these different cultures. And actually it's only really in recent years that women have been able to start to assert what they understand and what they want from love and marriage. And so I think it would add that additional nuance to say where it's a male-led narrative or where it's a female-led narrative. And you can complicate that as well, because in Korean dramas, for example, a strong narrative is around the mother having a very controlling role over what's happening with the marriage. So it's not just patriarchy all the way down to present day. The mother's very implicated in defining the marriage relationships, and particularly status and class. So I thought if you have time, it'd be good to hear your comments.
Yeah, we did not have so much time to develop of all these dimensions, but thank you so much for the question. You're right on the importance of taking in account gender issues in this and how the ideal is defined. I would say that Korean dramas are a bit part of this hyper-idealization of love, right? And that makes it somehow looking unworldly, unrealistic, and something that actually people do not confuse with reality. But there are these patterns, as you said, this question of the role of mother, for example, in impulsing and controlling who can marry whom is significant. And I have not the time, but obviously there are so many cases in all the literature, in my own research, but in so many others where you see the intervention of parents, sometimes mothers, obviously, and who can be also sometimes, in my research, I remember in China, using extremely derogative comments about potential wives for their son, so derogative that it makes any of the relationship impossible to develop into a future. And you have also interventions of father that usually are strictly followed by the children, even if they were introducing someone they had met by themselves and they were introducing as being in love with. So these are important actually dimensions all over the place. And yes, there is much more to say about the history and how it's into complicated than I could. As you saw, it was still too long what I did even thought. I tried to tighten it so much.
We are short of time, so thank you so very much. If there are more questions, you can just contact him during the break or email.
Yes.
Thank you so very much. And now we have our next chair, Russian single, for our next section.